What they lost was not just you. What they lost was the only version of themselves that ever felt genuine, and that did not come to them slowly or gently. It landed last night without warning, in the quiet, sudden and without mercy. Because silence is where truth stops waiting for permission to be heard. It started as something small, just a thought that flickered at the edge of their mind, something they tried to wave away before it could settle. But the deeper parts of the mind do not negotiate. They observe, they wait, and then, when the conditions are right, they surface with everything they have been holding. And this is where it becomes something more than ordinary sadness. Because what they felt was not simply the feeling of missing you. It was something far more destabilizing than that. It was the sudden and terrifying recognition that not a single other person has ever seen them the way you did. Not even close. You were not just someone who cared about them in the way most people care, warmly, at a distance, with limits. You were the one who understood the parts of them they kept buried from the people around them, and more unsettlingly, the parts they had buried from themselves. Most people never come to understand this about love. Love at its truest is not really about attention or affection. It is about exposure. It is about being witnessed fully, and you witnessed them without flinching, without judging, without looking away. That is rare, and it is almost unbearable, because when someone genuinely sees you, they do not just see what you want them to see. They see what you are working to conceal. You saw the insecurity that lived just below the surface of their confidence. You saw the fear that their control was built around protecting. You saw the hollow space their distractions were designed to fill, and yet you stayed. You did not recoil or reduce them, and that created something inside them that they had no tools to manage. Attachment that came wrapped in fear, desire that kept bumping up against resistance, a pull toward closeness that existed at the same time as an urgent need to get away. Psychologists would describe this as a conflict between the conscious self and the deeper, unprocessed interior. But they did not have a name for it. They only felt it pressing against them and did what most people do when the feeling becomes too large. They avoided it, because being deeply understood is actually more confronting than being overlooked. Being ignored feels manageable. Being truly seen feels like being caught. And they were nowhere near ready to be caught, so they began to sabotage things, not in ways that were obvious or deliberate, subtly, gradually, almost without realizing it was happening. A reply that came a little too late, a sudden cooling when warmth was what the moment needed, an argument manufactured out of nothing, small withdrawals that appeared random but were anything but. These were not mistakes. They were the mind's way of rebuilding the distance that felt safe. Because the closer you came, the louder the noise inside them grew. And here is the truth they could not bring themselves to look at. You were not making them uncomfortable with who you were. You were making them aware of who they were, aware of every wound they had not finished healing, every unmet need they were still pretending did not exist, every quiet fear that they were fundamentally not enough and that given enough time you would see that too. You did not create any of that in them. It was already there. What you did was bring it to the surface, and they resented you for that, even as they loved you in a way they had never loved anyone else. That contradiction slowly became unbearable to carry. Because how do you stay close to someone who sees your truth when your entire life has been organized around making sure no one does? The answer is that you do not. You run, and that is what they did. But here is where it turns brutal. Running does not delete what is true. It only delays the moment you have to face it. And last night, that delay ran out. It was not dramatic. There were no tears and no visible collapse. Just a quiet moment where the pieces suddenly arranged themselves into something undeniable. They looked at the people around them, at the conversations they were having, at everything they had been using to fill the space, and they felt nothing that went anywhere real, because none of it had substance. None of it had you. And then something clicked into place that they had not been prepared for. It was not that they missed your company. It was that nothing else was capable of replacing the way you perceived them. Nobody else saw through the surface. Nobody else held a mirror up to the parts of them they had learned to keep in the dark. Nobody else had ever made them feel both completely accepted and completely exposed at the exact same time. And in that moment, the full weight of what they had lost became clear. It was not just a person they had let go of. It was the only mirror that had ever shown them who they actually were, and without it, they had begun to drift into versions of themselves that felt hollow and unrecognizable. Every interaction since has felt like it is missing a layer. Every connection that forms feels like it is happening only on the surface. Every smile that comes is followed by the sense that something underneath is not engaged. Because once you have experienced genuine depth in another person, the shallow end becomes impossible to pretend is enough. But they tried. They told themselves you were replaceable, that what you shared was not as uncommon as it felt, that eventually someone else would come along and fill that space. But the subconscious is not a cooperative narrator. It makes comparisons without asking. It runs them constantly, relentlessly, and every single comparison circles back to the same conclusion they cannot escape. Nobody understands them the way you did. Nobody is going to. And that is suffocating, because it forces them to confront the thing they have been avoiding since the moment things fell apart. They did not lose you to circumstance or to bad timing or to forces outside their control. They lost you to their own choices, a long sequence of small, fear-driven, mostly unconscious decisions that accumulated into something that could not be undone. And now there is no rewinding. There is no hidden second chance sitting somewhere in the background. There is only awareness, raw, unfiltered, and impossible to close back up. Because once you have genuinely seen something true, you do not get to unsee it. And last night, they saw everything. But here is what they still have not fully grasped. What they are dealing with is not really regret. It is something that runs at a much deeper level than regret. It is not simply the loss of you that is breaking them open. It is what your love revealed about them. It is the confrontation with why they were never truly ready to receive it. And that truth is only just beginning to show itself in full. The mind does not fracture when something ends. It fractures when something real refuses to stay suppressed any longer. And last night, something in them stopped cooperating with the story it had been told. It stopped going numb on command. It stopped manufacturing distance from what was true. It stopped doing the work of keeping them insulated from themselves. And what followed was not a controlled process. The moment denial stops functioning, everything that has been held underneath comes to the surface at once. Not in any logical order, in fragments, in moments and memories that were once dismissed but now return, carrying a weight they did not have before. The way you looked at them when they could not manage to look at themselves. The quiet you held without trying to rearrange it or fill it with something more comfortable. The patience they depended on while pretending they were completely fine without it. They had convinced themselves that kind of presence was something they could always find, that it was not particularly rare, but that was wrong. What you offered was not standard, it was singular, and rare things do not return to people who have already demonstrated they cannot take care of them. Most people never quite understand this. We do not lose people because they eventually stopped feeling something for us. We lose them because we were not paying close enough attention when we still had access to what they were offering. And being able to pay that attention requires a level of self-awareness that demands confronting things most people spend entire lifetimes avoiding. So they found other explanations. They told themselves you were too much, too emotional, too intense, too demanding of something they were not ready to give. But what they were actually saying underneath all of that was that you were forcing them to feel things they had built their entire adult life around not feeling, and they could not tolerate that, because feeling deeply means releasing control, and control was not just a preference for them, it was identity. It was the structure their sense of self was built on, the thing that created the appearance of stability, but you kept moving through it, not through force or strategy, just through the way you showed up. And presence is the one thing the defended self cannot neutralize. You did not chase them. You did not perform or make yourself smaller to keep them comfortable. You simply remained. And that made them uneasy in a way they could not manipulate their way out of. They could not predict you. They could not reduce you to something simple enough to manage. They could not control the shape of what was between you. And so the internal tension became unbearable. Part of them felt safer with you than they had ever felt anywhere. Another part felt too exposed to stay. Part of them wanted nothing more than to remain. Another part kept pushing toward the exit. This was not confusion. It was a fracture between the version of themselves they presented to the world and the version you were quietly uncovering. When the defense mechanisms collapse, anxiety rushes into the space they were holding, and they pointed that anxiety in your direction. They called it your fault. They let the discomfort become something they associated with you, rather than with what you were bringing to the surface in them. But you were not the source of their unease. You were the thing that made their carefully constructed self-image stop working, and that made you simultaneously irresistible and impossible to stay near. So they manufactured distance because distance restores the illusion of control. It lets the ego rebuild its walls. It makes everything feel manageable again. But here is what they are now forced to reckon with. Distance does not actually heal anything. It temporarily numbs. And numbness does not last forever. Last night the numbness expired. And without that buffer, everything they had been storing underneath came back unfiltered and without warning. They did not just think about you. They felt you, the depth of it. The particular quality of being known and accepted without condition at the same time. And with that came something heavier than longing. Guilt. Not the kind that surfaces briefly and passes. The kind that parks itself somewhere in the chest and stays. Because now they understand something they could not access before. You were not asking too much of them. You were offering something they did not believe at the most fundamental level that they deserved. The belief that they were eventually going to fall short. That if they allowed you to get close enough, you would see what they feared was true about themselves, and you would leave. So they left first. A preemptive retreat. A way of controlling the ending before it could happen to them. But here is the paradox that is now impossible for them to rationalize away. In trying to protect themselves from being abandoned, they became the one who abandoned. They were not the one who was cast aside or misunderstood or unloved. They were the one who pushed away the only love that had ever reached somewhere real in them. And sitting with that is devastating because there is nowhere to redirect it. Every new connection they have attempted since then only highlights the absence. They hear words but feel nothing genuine behind them. They sense effort from other people but feel no real comprehension within it. Because once you have experienced being truly recognized by another person, every other interaction registers as an approximation at best. They try to replace the silence with noise, with people, with activity, with temporary connections that asked nothing complicated of them, but none of it touched what you touched without even appearing to try. That is the part that will not leave them alone. You did not work at understanding them. You simply did. And that kind of connection is not something that can be engineered through better effort or more willing partners. It requires something that cannot be faked, vulnerability, a genuine willingness to be seen without managing the impression. And they still do not know how to get there without fear taking over. So they remain caught in a loop, wanting what they pushed away, but still not fully equipped to receive it without their own defenses closing back over it. That tension does not release. It just keeps accumulating quietly, because every moment they spend without that quality of connection adds another piece of evidence to the case they do not want to make against themselves. They had it. They dismantled it, and they cannot find it anywhere else. But what is even more unsettling than missing you is what they are now being forced to examine. Because this is no longer just about your absence. It is about what your presence awakened in them, and what your absence is now demanding they look at. Something has shifted inside them, something that cannot be walked back. A change in how they see themselves and their patterns and the way fear has been running their decisions for longer than they realized. The more aware they become, the less they can escape the implications of that awareness. And the deeper it goes, the harder the edge they are being pushed toward. There comes a point where the things that used to work as distractions simply stop working. Not in stages, all at once, as if a switch gets thrown, and suddenly everything that once created a sense of distance from the truth becomes hollow and transparent. They have reached that point. Not by choice, but because the psyche can only maintain pressure against something real for so long before the pressure becomes the problem. And now silence is not empty for them anymore. It is crowded. It is filled with everything they chose to set aside when you were present. Every feeling they shut down before it could fully form. Every realization they glimpsed and immediately looked away from. Every moment something genuine moved in them and they instinctively suppressed it. All of it is returning now, not as soft memory, as evidence. Evidence of who they were when they were close to you, set against who they are without you. And the gap between those two versions of themselves is disturbing. With you, something in them softened in a way that was real, not weakened, opened, not performing, actually honest. A version of themselves they barely had language for, but quietly needed more than they admitted. And now that version has gone. Or perhaps even worse than gone, it only ever existed because of you. And if that is true, then who are they right now? That question does not land softly. It fractures something in the foundation, because it pushes them towards something they have never genuinely wanted to examine. The fact that they do not fully know themselves, not at any level that is real and honest. They know the version that performs for the world, the version that adapts to what the situation seems to require, the version that protects itself. But the version that simply felt, that one only came fully alive in your presence. And now they are searching for it without understanding why it cannot be found. Most people do not recognize this dynamic. We do not only fall in love with another person, we fall in love with the version of ourselves that their presence makes accessible. You gave them a way into a self they could not reach on their own. That is why losing you does not feel like losing a person in the ordinary sense. It feels like losing a part of themselves. And that kind of loss is far more disorienting because people can theoretically be replaced. But an entire dimension of your own identity is something else entirely. So they keep trying to recreate the feeling without understanding what actually produced it. They reach toward new people. They attempt new connections. They perform closeness. But something is always missing, always slightly off, always carrying the faint sense of being constructed rather than real. Because what is absent is the one thing that cannot be manufactured: authentic exposure. The experience of being seen without having to curate what is being shown. And now every new interaction requires them to perform again. And that performance is exhausting in a way it never used to be, because they have had a taste of what it felt like to put it down. And they gave that up, without fully understanding what they were walking away from. And now the understanding is arriving in pieces, steadily, in moments they cannot predict or prepare for. Regret does not tend to arrive in one large wave. It seeps in through a random thought, a song that did not ask for permission to matter, a memory that resurfaces during an ordinary moment and brings everything back with it. The safety, the connection, the depth that once made them want to retreat but now feels like the only place they were ever genuinely themselves. And the recognition of that does not bring relief. It brings the particular discomfort of understanding something too late. They were not overwhelmed by you. They were overwhelmed by themselves, by what your presence uncovered in them, by the parts of themselves they were not yet willing to stand in front of. And instead of choosing to grow into that awareness, they moved away from it. And now they cannot go back to who they were before you because that version feels thin and unconvincing. But they also do not know how to move forward, because moving forward requires confronting every single thing they have spent years expertly avoiding. The fear of being fundamentally inadequate, the ongoing need for validation that they would never openly admit to, the inability to stay in vulnerability without converting it into something that feels more controlled. And facing all of that strips away the mechanisms they have always relied on. It leaves them with something unprotected and unfiltered, the truth about who they are beneath the careful construction. And the truth is this: they did not lose you because something was wrong between you. They lost you because you were too aligned with what was real, too honest for the self-image they were still trying to maintain, too willing to go deep for someone who had built their entire survival strategy around staying at the surface. They wanted something genuine. But the moment something genuine asked for genuine honesty in return, they pulled back from it. And that contradiction is what will not allow them to rest, because every attempt at connection since then returns them to the same place, the awareness of what they could not hold on to. And every return to that awareness pushes them one step closer to something they have been resisting for a very long time. Responsibility, not shame, not punishment. Responsibility, the understanding that what they lost was not taken from them by circumstances or by fate. It slipped away because they did not yet have the capacity to hold it properly. And that understanding does not arrive and break a person all at once. It comes gradually. It reshapes things slowly and with considerable discomfort. Because growth does not begin with expansion. It begins with dismantling, and they are still in that phase, where the old structure is coming apart and the new one has not taken shape yet, where everything feels uncertain and unstable and unrecognizable. Something is shifting inside them at a level they cannot reverse, a recognition of their own patterns that they cannot now claim not to see, their own fears rendered visible, their own history of self-sabotage laid out in a way that no longer allows for the comfortable stories they once used to explain it. But awareness that arrives without resolution creates its own particular kind of pressure, and that pressure keeps building because the more clearly they see, the less the old evasions work, and the closer they get to the thing they have always been most afraid of facing, a truth that does not just explain what happened between you, a truth that reveals who they actually are underneath everything they have been performing, and when that truth surfaces completely, nothing stays the same. The final unraveling does not come with noise. It does not make an entrance. It arrives quietly, like something deep inside simply stopping the effort of maintaining what was never real. And when it does, the story they have been telling themselves about who they are shifts, not the facts of their life. The interpretation, the narrative they built to make themselves make sense to themselves. And that is where it becomes permanent. Because the mind can absorb pain. It can carry loss. But it cannot encounter genuine clarity and remain unchanged by it. And clarity is exactly what they are facing now, with nothing softening it, no self-protecting distortions, no convenient revision of events, no story that makes them the reasonable one, just what is true, without any of the comfort that was layered over it before. They can see it fully now. You were not the problem in what happened. You were the disruption. The thing that interrupted the long pattern of emotional avoidance they had been running on, the living contradiction of everything they had come to believe about what closeness felt like. And instead of letting that disruption teach them something, they removed it, because it was asking something they were not willing to give, not honesty toward you, honesty toward themselves. Most people do not understand this when they examine why they pull away from love. We do not run from love because it is not strong enough. We run because it is accurate. Because it finds exactly the places where we are incomplete, exactly the fears we have not resolved, exactly the wounds that are still open beneath the surface we have been carefully maintaining. And you were precise in that way, not because you were trying to be, effortlessly, without strategy. You did not attempt to fix them or change them. You simply reflected them. And once someone has been reflected that clearly, there are only two directions available: toward growth or toward escape. They chose escape, but here is what is now taking them apart. Escape does not preserve a person. It freezes them at the exact point they were trying to flee from. So while your life kept moving and developing, they remained fixed. Or worse, they moved backward. They became more defended, more reliant on interactions that asked nothing real of them, more comfortable in the shallow water because depth had shown them something they were not ready to carry. Because now depth comes with a price they fully understand, and that price is self-confrontation, being required to stand in front of themselves honestly without charm or logic or distance to create a buffer, and they cannot avoid it any longer, because your absence removed the last comfortable illusion, the one that told them they could experience something genuine without being required to change. That illusion is gone, and in the space it occupied is something that is far less comfortable to live with: accountability. Not performed accountability, the kind that is felt in the body, the kind that quietly changes the way you see every decision you have ever made. They look back differently now. Every moment you reached toward them and they withdrew. Every time you tried to be understood and they deflected rather than received it. Every instance where they were physically present but had already left emotionally. All of it reads differently now, with a clarity that makes it impossible to reframe into something more forgiving of themselves. And this is where the final understanding lands. You did not love them at the level they allowed the world to see. You loved them at the depth they had been working their whole lives to keep hidden. And that kind of love does not simply evaporate when it ends. It leaves something permanent behind, a psychological imprint that changes the way every future experience registers, which means the truth of what this was becomes something they carry forward without end. No one else is going to love them the way you did. Not because others are incapable, but because they are no longer the same person you once saw. That person only existed in full when you were there to witness them. And the part that cuts the deepest is that they know this. They feel it in every connection that falls short, in every exchange that should feel like something but does not, in every moment where all the right conditions are present and yet something essential is missing. Because what you gave them was not simply care or affection or even love in the ordinary sense. It was alignment, a convergence between who they were and who they had the potential to become. And they rejected it, not with cruelty, with fear. But fear does not cancel consequences. It produces them, and they are now living inside those consequences, not in any visible or dramatic way, but internally, constantly, without relief. Because once you have been truly seen by another person, you cannot return to invisibility, not even in your own eyes. And that is the real weight of what they are carrying. Not the loss of you as a presence in their life, but the knowledge of exactly what they lost and exactly why they lost it, and the requirement of continuing to live as the version of themselves that made that choice. That is not a temporary discomfort. That is identity-level reckoning. And identity, once it has been cracked open by something true, does not simply heal back into its original shape. It either transforms or it fractures further. And right now they are standing at that threshold, between who they have always been and who the truth is now demanding they become, with no story left to hide behind. No distraction powerful enough to cover what they now understand. Just one truth that will not stop echoing through everything they feel. They did not lose someone who loved them. They lost the only person who ever made them face who they really are.